Before we dive into one of the most shocking stories of institutional failure you've never heard about, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because what happened in that hearing room in 1962 should matter to every person in every country who believes that truth matters more than ego. This is the story of how the most powerful intelligence agency in the world almost lost the Cold War because they refused to listen to the quietest voice in the room. And when that voice finally spoke loud enough that they couldn't ignore it anymore, what came out shattered everything they thought they knew about intelligence, about loyalty, and about who really keeps us safe when the people in charge are too arrogant to admit they're wrong. Let me take you back to February 1962. The world is balanced on a knife's edge. The Berlin Wall went up 6 months ago. Nuclear arsenals are growing on both sides. And inside a cramped basement office at CIA headquarters, a woman named Eleanor Vance is staring at a stack of intelligence reports that everyone else has already dismissed as irrelevant noise. Eleanor is 42 years old, the daughter of a Pennsylvania coal miner, and she's been working as a mid-level analyst in the Soviet Affairs Division for 8 years. She doesn't have an Ivy League degree. She didn't come from a political family. She doesn't play golf with senators or attend cocktail parties in Georgetown. What she has is something far more dangerous to the established order. She's right. And she's been right for months, and absolutely nobody wants to hear it. See, Eleanor has been filing reports, detailed, meticulously researched intelligence assessments, warning that the Soviets are planning something unprecedented. Not just troop movements, not just the usual saber rattling, something that could fundamentally shift the balance of power. Her reports cite intercepted communications, unusual diplomatic traffic, suspicious shipping manifests, pattern, analysis of Soviet naval deployments. Everything points to a coordinated operation designed to place offensive strategic assets within striking distance of the American mainland. But every single report she submitted has been stamped with the same soul-crushing designation: low priority, no action required. And every time she tries to escalate, she hits the same wall of dismissive arrogance that has defined her entire career. The men who run the Soviet Affairs Division, and they are all men, have already decided that Eleanor Vance doesn't have the pedigree, the instincts, or frankly, the right to challenge their assessments. They went to Harvard and Yale. They speak the King's English. They summer in Martha's Vineyard. Eleanor speaks with a working-class Pennsylvania accent and brings her lunch in a paper bag. To them, she's essentially clerical staff with delusions of relevance. But here's what they don't know about Eleanor Vance, what nobody knows because she's never had the platform to show them. Eleanor doesn't just speak Russian, she speaks Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, and conversational Georgian, all self-taught, using records and books she borrowed from libraries, studying late at night after everyone else had gone home. She has a photographic memory that allows her to cross-reference details from reports filed months or even years apart, seeing connections that elude analysts who rely purely on intuition and Cold War conventional wisdom. And most importantly, Eleanor has something that no amount of Ivy League education can buy. She has a source, a low-level Soviet shipping clerk named Dmitri, who defected 3 years ago, who trusts Eleanor because she's the only analyst who treated him like a human being instead of an intelligence asset to be exploited, and who has been feeding her information that paints a terrifying picture of what's coming. On the morning of February 14th, 1962, Eleanor does something that breaks every unwritten rule of CIA hierarchy. She bypasses her entire chain of command and hand-delivers a 23-page intelligence assessment directly to the Deputy Director of Intelligence. The report is titled Operation Anadir, Soviet Strategic Deployment to Western Hemisphere, Immediate Threat Assessment. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't apologize. She walks into that sixth-floor office like she has every right to be there, places the report on the deputy director's desk, and says 5 words that will change everything. Sir, we're running out of time. Within an hour, Eleanor is summoned to a conference room, but she's not being congratulated. She's being interrogated. Sitting across from her are 3 men who represent everything wrong with institutional arrogance. There's Bradford Ashworth III, the Chief of Soviet Affairs, Harvard 38 OSS veteran, a man who genuinely believes that intelligence analysis is a gentleman's profession unsuitable for secretaries who should know their place. James Keller, the Director of Estimates, a former Wall Street banker who treats intelligence work like stock speculation and has built his reputation on confidently wrong assessments delivered with unwavering certainty. And there's Richard Drummond, the CIA's Golden Boy operations chief, charismatic, reckless, a man who believes that real intelligence work happens in the field with guns and bribes, not in basement offices with filing cabinets. Bradford opens the interrogation with the kind of child who's made a mess. Miss Vance, Eleanor. Can I call you Eleanor? He doesn't wait for an answer. We've reviewed your report, and we're concerned not about Soviet activities, you understand. We're concerned about you. This is the 7th time in 4 months you've attempted to escalate analysis that has already been reviewed and appropriately categorized by your superiors. We're starting to wonder if perhaps the stress of this work might be affecting your judgment. James Keller leans back in his chair, a smile playing at his lips. I'm curious, Miss Vance. Your report cites a pattern analysis and coordinated intelligence indicators. But when we look at the same raw intelligence you're seeing, we see normal Soviet naval exercises, routine diplomatic communications, the same posturing we've observed for years. What makes you think you're seeing something that our entire senior analytical staff is missing? Eleanor meets his gaze without flinching. Her voice is quiet but steady. Because I'm actually reading the reports, sir. Not just the summaries, not just the parts that confirm what you already believe. The temperature in the room drops 10 degrees. Richard Drummond, who has been silent until now, suddenly leans forward. His voice drips with barely concealed hostility. That's a serious accusation, Miss Vance. You're suggesting that senior intelligence officers are, what? Incompetent? Lazy? Or are you suggesting something worse? He lets that implication hang in the air. In 1962, in the CIA, suggesting that someone's analysis might be compromised by ideology or worse is tantamount to accusing them of treason. Eleanor doesn't take the bait. I'm suggesting that institutional assumptions can blind us to emerging threats. That's not incompetence, that's human nature, but it's also dangerous. Bradford's condescension hardens into open contempt. Let me be very clear, young lady. As a research analyst, you were hired, not a strategic assessor, not a policy advisor, certainly not someone qualified to second-guess the collective judgment of the most experienced intelligence professionals in the world. Your job is to compile data, to organize information that your superiors, people with actual experience, actual strategic training, can then properly analyze and assess. You've overstepped dramatically. If I've overstepped, Eleanor responds, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel. Now, then I'd like someone to explain why every single indicator I cited in my previous reports has subsequently proven accurate. The unusual naval deployments I flagged in October, confirmed by satellite reconnaissance last month, the diplomatic traffic surge I noted in November, now understood to involve secret negotiations regarding base access, the shipping manifest anomalies I highlighted in December. Turns out, those agricultural equipment deliveries included crates dimensioned hardware. James Keller waves his hand dismissively. Coincidence and confirmation bias. You're cherry-picking data points that happen to align with your predetermined conclusion. That's not analysis. That's paranoia dressed up in bureaucratic language. The meeting goes on for another 40 minutes. 3 powerful men, each taking turns trying to humiliate, discredit, or intimidate this woman who refuses to back down. They question her methodology. They mock her sources. They imply she's emotionally unstable, intellectually overmatched, possibly even sympathetic to the Soviets given her obsession with them. They remind her that her career hangs by a thread, that she has no allies, no protection, no path forward except through their approval. The subtext is clear. Shut up, sit down, and stick to your typewriter. Eleanor sits through it all with her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral, her breathing steady. When they finally finish, when they've exhausted their arsenal of institutional bullying, she looks at each of them in turn, and then she says something that stops them cold. Gentlemen, I have a question. When I'm proven right, and I will be proven right, how many American lives will you consider an acceptable price for protecting your egos? The silence in that room is deafening. Bradford's face turns purple. James looks like he's been slapped. Richard's hand actually clenches into a fist. For a moment, it seems like they might throw her out of the building entirely, strip her security clearance, end her career right there. But they can't, because despite everything, despite their arrogance and their contempt, there's a small, quiet voice in each of their minds whispering, "What if she's right?" They dismiss her with a warning. Stay in your lane, stop making waves, and for God's sake, stop filing these alarmist reports that waste everyone's time. Eleanor leaves that conference room knowing she's been branded, knowing she's made enemies of the most powerful people in the agency, knowing that her career is almost certainly over. But she also leaves knowing something else. She's not going to stop. Because this isn't about her career anymore. It's about being right when being wrong could cost millions of lives. Over the next 6 weeks, Eleanor does something extraordinary. Since the official channels are closed to her, she builds a shadow case file. She corresponds with Dmitry through secure dead drops. She cultivates relationships with low-level analysts in other divisions, people like her, people who've been dismissed or overlooked, people who notice things that the brass are too important to see. She teaches herself to read Soviet technical manuals because she suspects the agricultural equipment story is cover for something specific. And slowly, piece by piece, she assembles a picture that's even worse than her original assessment. The Soviets aren't just planning to position assets near America. They're planning to position nuclear-capable missiles, not in Siberia, not in Eastern Europe, in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. And according to Dmitry's latest information, the timeline has accelerated. They're not planning this for next year or even next month. They're doing it now. Ships are already en route. Eleanor files one more report. This one is 37 pages long. It includes technical specifications, translated intercepts, photographic analysis of shipping crates that she personally obtained by befriending a dock worker in New Jersey who owed her a favor, testimony from Dmitry, and a detailed strategic assessment of what Soviet missile deployment to Cuba would mean for American security. She titles it Imminent Threat, Soviet Strategic Missile Deployment to Cuba, 72-hour warning, and once again she hand-delivers it, this time to the Director of Central Intelligence himself. What happens next is unprecedented. Eleanor is not just summoned to a meeting, she's summoned to an emergency session of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. It's April 3rd, 1962. In the room are the Director of the CIA, the Secretary of Defense, 3 senior military commanders, and a half-dozen of the most powerful intelligence officials in the country, including, of course, Bradford Ashworth III, James Keller, and Richard Drummond, the 3 men who have spent months trying to bury her. The director opens the session with a simple statement. Miss Vance, you've made some extraordinary claims that, if true, would require us to fundamentally reassess our entire strategic posture toward Cuba and the Soviet Union. Claims that contradict the assessments of our most senior analysts. So I'm going to give you 30 minutes. 30 minutes to convince this room that you know something we don't. And Miss Vance, if you can't make that case, if this turns out to be the same alarmist speculation we've seen from you before, then your employment with this agency is terminated. Effective immediately. Do you understand? Eleanor stands. She understands perfectly. This is her one chance, her only chance, and she's prepared for it in ways that none of them can possibly imagine. She begins by doing something unexpected. She doesn't start with her conclusions. She starts with their mistakes. Gentlemen, she says, her voice clear and unwavering, before I present my evidence, I need to address why you missed this. Not because I want to embarrass anyone, but because understanding our institutional blind spots is the only way to prevent this from happening again. Bradford interrupts immediately. Miss Vance, we didn't bring you here for a lecture on... You missed it, Eleanor continues, speaking over him with a confidence that shocks everyone in the room, because you assumed Soviet strategic thinking follows Western rational actor models. You missed it because you dismissed signals that didn't fit your preconceptions. You missed it because you prioritized human intelligence from high-level sources over pattern analysis from mundane data. You missed it because your analytical framework is designed to protect institutional consensus, not challenge it. And most importantly, you missed it because when a mid-level analyst, without the right pedigree, tried to tell you what you were missing, you questioned her mental stability instead of examining her evidence. The room erupts. Multiple people try to speak at once. The director slams his hand on the table. Miss Vance, that is completely inappropriate. The Soviets, Eleanor says, raising her voice for the first time, are currently transporting 36 R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles and 24 R-14 intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Cuba. The R-12s have a range of 2,000 kilometers. The R-14s can reach 3,000. Together, they can strike every major city in the eastern United States and most targets throughout the continental U.S. The first shipment left the Black Sea on March 15th aboard the freighter Omsk. Subsequent shipments are following on 8 additional vessels, all masquerading as agricultural missions. Construction of the launch sites in Cuba has already begun in Pinar del Rio province. Conservative estimate they'll be operational within 3 months, possibly sooner. The silence now is different. It's not the silence of dismissal. It's the silence of dawning horror. James Keller finds his voice first, but it's shaking. That's impossible. Our intelligence indicates... Your intelligence, Eleanor interrupts, indicates what you wanted it to indicate. You saw Soviet shipments and classified them as economic aid. You saw construction activity and classified it as defensive installations. You saw diplomatic communications and classified them as routine. I saw the same data and classified it as a strategic deployment because I wasn't filtering it through the assumption that the Soviets would never be bold enough to do something this provocative. Richard Drummond leans forward, his earlier hostility replaced with something else. Not respect, not yet, but attention. Miss Vance, even if we accept your interpretation of the shipping data, how can you possibly know the specific types of missiles? That level of technical detail? Eleanor reaches into her briefcase and pulls out a thick folder. Because 3 months ago I taught myself to read Russian technical manuals. Because I obtained schematics legally from open Soviet publications that nobody else bothered to translate. Because I cross-referenced crate dimensions from the shipping manifests against the physical specifications of every Soviet missile system in production. The crates leaving the Black Sea are 12.5 meters long. The only Soviet missile that matches those dimensions is the R-12. The larger crates at 16.3 meters, R-14s. It's not intelligence magic, gentlemen. It's basic geometry combined with actually doing the work. She begins, distributing documents from her folder, translated technical specifications, photographic evidence of the shipping crates, grainy but unmistakable, intercepted communications with her own annotations, testimony from Dmitri, corroborated by 3 other sources, pattern analysis showing the correlation between diplomatic activity and deployment timelines. And then she does something that changes everything. I know what you're thinking, Eleanor says, her voice softer now. You're thinking this is interesting, concerning, possibly even credible. But you're also thinking, even if she's right about the missiles, how do we know the timeline? How do we know this is happening now and not next year? She pauses, meeting each pair of eyes in the room. You're thinking that because you're still trying to find a reason not to act, a reason to maintain the status quo, a reason to not admit that you missed the most significant intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. Bradford has recovered some of his composure. Miss Vance, you're making extraordinary accusations about the professional judgment of... I'm making factual statements about institutional failure, Eleanor cuts him off. And I'm making them because we don't have time for egos anymore. The reason I know the timeline is because of this. She pulls out one more document. Dmitri didn't just tell me about the missiles. He told me about Project Anadir, the Soviet code name for the operation. He told me that Khrushchev personally approved the deployment after the Bay of Pigs humiliated him. He told me that the Soviets see this as restoring balance after we deployed Jupiter missiles to Turkey. And he told me that the operational deadline is October. The Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't start in October, gentlemen. It starts in March. We're just not paying attention. Every person in that room is staring at her now. The director of Central Intelligence looks like he's aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Cuban Missile Crisis, he asks quietly. That's what they'll call it, Eleanor says. If we're lucky, if we detect it in time, if we manage to avoid nuclear war. She takes a breath. Or we can call it what it should be called. The Vance warning. The intelligence assessment that could have prevented the entire crisis if anyone had been willing to listen. For the next hour, Eleanor fields questions. Technical questions about missile capabilities. Strategic questions about Soviet intentions. Procedural questions about her sources and methods. And she answers every single one with the kind of detailed, unshakable expertise that makes it impossible to dismiss her as a hysterical woman who doesn't know her place. She doesn't just know the intelligence. She knows it better than anyone else in the room, better than the Harvard graduates, better than the OSS veterans, better than the operations chiefs with their field experience and their war stories. And slowly, as the reality of what she's presenting sinks in, The atmosphere in the room transforms. The skepticism becomes concern. The concern becomes alarm. The alarm becomes action. Orders are given. Reconnaissance assets are redirected. The president is briefed. And sitting in the corner of the room, Bradford Ashworth III, James Keller, and Richard Drummond are forced to watch as the woman they spent months trying to destroy becomes the most important intelligence analyst in the country. But the story doesn't end there, because Eleanor Vance isn't done. When the initial shock passes, when the room starts discussing how to respond to the threat, Eleanor speaks up one more time. Gentlemen, before we move to response options, there's something else you need to understand. Something I didn't include in the written report because I wasn't sure you'd believe me even about the missiles. Everyone stops. The director looks at her with something approaching dread. What else, Miss Vance? The missiles in Cuba are a diversion, Eleanor says quietly. They're real, they're dangerous, and we need to address them. But the Soviets know we'll eventually detect them. They're counting on it. Because while we're focused on Cuba, they're positioning submarine-based assets in the North Atlantic, not to invade, to create a second crisis that forces us to divide our attention and our resources. Project Anadyr isn't just about Cuba. It's about testing whether we can handle multiple simultaneous strategic threats. And based on how we've performed so far, I'd say the Soviets have good reason to think the answer is no. The revelation hits like a bomb. If the first part of Eleanor's presentation was shocking, this is catastrophic. Because if she's right, and by now nobody in the room doubts that she's right, then they're not facing one crisis. They're facing a coordinated Soviet strategy designed to exploit American institutional weaknesses, the exact institutional weaknesses that Eleanor has been trying to warn them about for months. Bradford Ashworth III stands up. His face is pale. His hands are shaking. Director, I need to make a statement. He looks at Eleanor, and for the first time there's no condescension in his eyes. There's only shame. Miss Vance, I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you my resignation, because you're right about all of it. We dismissed you because you weren't one of us, because you didn't go to the right schools, because you didn't play the game the way we wanted it played. And in doing so, we almost... He can't finish the sentence. James Keller is next, the confident Wall Street banker who treated intelligence analysis like stock speculation. Looks like he's going to be sick. The February report, the one we marked low priority. I didn't even read past the first page. I saw your name and I assumed it was more of the same. More noise from someone who didn't understand how things work at the strategic level. He looks down at his, hands. How many people would have died if you'd given up? If you'd let us silence you? Richard Drummond doesn't stand. He just sits there, staring at Eleanor like he's seeing her for the first time. You know what the worst part is? He finally says. I actually read your October report. I read the whole thing, and I thought, she's not wrong about the data. But I didn't want to be the guy who validated the assessment of some mid-level analyst over the judgment of the senior staff. I didn't want to rock the boat, so I stayed quiet. I chose careerism over truth, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. The director of Central Intelligence stands. He's a career intelligence officer, a man who's seen his share of institutional failures, but even he looks shaken. Miss Vance, on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States government, I apologize. What was done to you, the dismissal, the contempt, the systematic suppression of your analysis, represents everything wrong with how we've been conducting intelligence work. You were right. You were right about everything. And we have failed you, and in doing so, we have failed the country. He turns to address the entire room. Effective immediately, Eleanor Vance is promoted to Senior Intelligence Analyst with direct reporting authority to my office. Every report she has filed in the past 6 months will be reviewed and acted upon, and I am personally directing an institutional review of how evaluate intelligence that challenges consensus assessments. Because Miss Vance has shown us something today that we all needed to see. The most dangerous threat to American security isn't Soviet missiles. It's American arrogance. Eleanor stands there, surrounded by the most powerful people in the intelligence community, all of them looking at her with a mixture of respect, shame, and gratitude. And in that moment, she does something that nobody expects. She doesn't gloat. She doesn't lecture. She doesn't weaponize their humiliation. Instead, she says this: "Thank you, Director, but I don't want apologies, and I don't want promotions. I want something much more important." She looks around the room. "I want every analyst in this building, every single person who's been dismissed or overlooked or told they don't have the pedigree to question the experts. I want them to know that their voice matters, that being right is more important than being popular, that institutional bucking authority for its own sake. It's about having the moral clarity to speak truth even when silence would be so much easier." She turns to Bradford, James, and Richard. "And to the three of you specifically, I want to say this: you're not bad people. You're not incompetent. You're victims of a system that rewards confidence over accuracy, consensus over dissent, pedigree over performance. What happened in that conference room in February wasn't personal. It was structural. Only way we fix it is if people like you, people with power, with platforms, with influence, use those positions to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Bradford has tears in his eyes. "How can you be so gracious after what we did to you?" Eleanor's smile is sad. "Because anger would be easy. Anger would feel justified. But anger won't keep us safe. Humility will. Listening will. Institutional courage will. You three made mistakes, catastrophic mistakes, but you're also here right now, admitting them, learning from them. That's redemption, gentlemen. That's what it looks like when ego surrenders to truth. The implementation of Eleanor's warnings prevents the Cuban Missile Crisis from escalating to the point of actual confrontation. By detecting the deployments early, by taking her analysis seriously, the Kennedy administration is able to engage in quiet diplomacy that results in the Soviets backing down before the crisis reaches the nuclear brink. Millions of lives are saved not through military confrontation, but through intelligence competence, finally meeting institutional humility. In the months that follow, Eleanor becomes a legend within the intelligence community, not just for being right, but for how she handled being vindicated. She mentors younger analysts, especially women and people from non-traditional backgrounds. She pushes for reforms that institutionalize dissent, that create formal channels for minority viewpoints, that reward analytical courage. Bradford Ashworth Theirs becomes one of her strongest allies, using his influence to protect analysts who challenge consensus. James Keller leaves the CIA and dedicates himself to teaching intelligence methodology at universities, always telling his students about the analyst who saw what the experts missed. Richard Drummond creates a program that recruits analysts from working-class backgrounds, determined to ensure that pedigree never again becomes a substitute for competence. But Eleanor's greatest legacy isn't about intelligence tradecraft or Cold War strategy. It's about a simple, powerful truth that resonates far beyond the classified corridors of Langley. Wisdom doesn't come with credentials. Truth doesn't care about your resume. And the quietest voice in the room might just be the one that saves the world if you're humble enough to listen. Because, in the end, the most sophisticated intelligence analysis in the world is worthless without the institutional humility to recognize that expertise can come from anywhere, that the daughter of a Pennsylvania coal miner who taught herself Russian might understand Soviet strategy better than Harvard graduates who assumed their education made them infallible, that the person everyone dismissed as mid-level clerical staff might be the only one seeing clearly while the experts are blinded by their own brilliance. The Cuban Missile Crisis, that never quite happened, became a classified case study, taught to every new CIA analyst. It's called the Vance Doctrine, and its lesson is simple: listen to the dismissed, question the consensus, trust the competent over the credentialed, and when someone without power tells you something that contradicts your assumptions, your first instinct shouldn't be to protect your ego. It should be to protect the truth. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters even when the powerful people aren't listening. Subscribe for more stories about the overlooked heroes who changed history not through fame or force, but through moral courage and unshakable competence. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but nobody would listen? How did you find the courage to keep speaking? Because Eleanor Vance's story isn't just about the Cold War. It's about every meeting, every workplace, every institution where truth gets sacrificed on the altar of consensus. And it's a reminder that the most powerful weapon against arrogance isn't matching it with more arrogance. It's meeting it with grace, with competence, and with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're right.